Okay, so today I'm going to look at the first official Smash 4 tier list all the way back from February 2016. Now, what I find interesting about this tier list is that it does not reflect the final version of the game. This tier list was made for version 1.1.3, where there's different balance and such. This tier list was actually released a couple of days before the next patch, so people back in the day complained about this tier list, and looking at the actual tier list itself, I do not blame them, even though people were mainly complaining because it was so close to a new patch. But just looking at this tier list itself, it's absolutely wild and just very wrong in a lot of places. So let's look at this tier list and see what it did right and what it did wrong. So in first place is Sheik, which, yeah, I can see that. She was better in this version of the game. Her needles had more range. Her throws had less knockbacks. So you had pretty good 50-50s out with them. And she was a little bit heavier. And Fair had a bit more range as well. Sheik was really good in this version of the game. And she very well could have been the best character. And she was still significantly nerfed from her original incarnation. But better than what she became later on. So first, I can see that. ZSS in second, I can see that too. ZSS was also a better character back then. Mainly that her down throw had less knockbacks, you can combo out of it even more reliably. Up air was a little bit stronger, and her up B was stronger. Those were the main things, and it made ZSS a scarier character because her ladder combos were even stronger than they would become in later versions of the game. So I could see her being second. Rosalina in third. No. She shouldn't even be in this S tier, she should be in the A tier. She's the same character she is now, pretty much. And there is quite a gap between her and these other two characters, and there's another character who should be in S tier, but we'll get to that a bit later. So yeah, Rosalina shouldn't be in S, she should be somewhere in the A tier. Too high. Now we're moving on to the A tier. Ryu, too high. He was the same character back then, and you know, he just wasn't that great. He was a pretty good character, but he wasn't an amazing character. He had pretty notable weaknesses. He should not be up here in the top of A. And if anything, he should be around B tier. So he's too high. Pikachu, I can just see Esam's influence right here. Pikachu is definitely too high as well. Again, Pikachu, pretty good character, but again, he just wasn't that great. You know, the typical Pikachu things, bad range, has some trouble killing against strong opponents. He just shouldn't be this high in the A tier. He should also be around B tier and such. So yeah, they're too high. Sonic, that's a pretty reasonable placement. And by the way, these two characters, Pikachu and Ryu, they were the same back then. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, Sonic, accurate placement. No complaints there. Fox, the funny thing about Fox is that he is 7th on every official Smash 4 tier list. It's funny. And this placement, I can see it. You could definitely rank him higher, but overall, it's not an egregious placement. Mario. I'm actually surprised Mario is this low. I thought he'd be a little bit higher, but apparently not. Mario was a good character, but 8 seems just a little bit too high, if you ask me. He was a character who did fall off later on in the meta. And he's the same character back then, I'll point out. 8 seems a little bit too high, but it might not be. Yeah, I don't have much to say about Mario. Then I'm surprised this placement isn't higher, and it shouldn't be higher, so I'm glad it's not higher. Diddy at ninth. This is wrong. Diddy most likely is anywhere between 4th to 7th in this version of the game. He's basically the same character, but he was also a pretty solid character, more solid than ninth. I mean, he's definitely better than Pikachu and Ryu and Mario as well. You can argue Sonic and Fox, but he is definitely not ninth. That is just too low. Meta Knight at 10th. I can see that. He was better back then. His up air was stronger at a more vertical angle, so his ladder combos were stronger. I can definitely see this. Maybe he could be a little bit higher though. I don't know. Now here's the funny tier. B tier. This is where things start to get really silly. In Pikachu and Ryu in top 5, that's already kind of crazy. But this is where it gets more crazy. Villager in 11th. Wow. Villager was a very highly rated character in early Smash 4, but that wasn't because he was a better character. He's pretty much the same character in this version. I think it was mainly because people didn't really know the matchup to the full extent, and there were strong Villager players doing well back then. Villager was definitely a solid character, but 11th? No way. He's like D tier at best, or E tier. He is just way too high. He shouldn't be up here, even in this version of the game where there's no Bayo or Korin. Like, he shouldn't be up here, for sure. And then, below him is Cloud. Cloud is 12th. That is so funny and so insane. Cloud should be an S. Easy. He's top 3. Easy peasy. Where in top 3? I'm not 100% sure, but he's definitely top 3. Rosalina shouldn't be up here. Cloud should be. Cloud was a better character back then. A whole bunch of his moves hit harder, including his up air. He had more access to limit, since it took less time to charge. Limit cross slash was stronger. Aerial finishing touch was way stronger. Cloud was busted. He just completely nullified a whole bunch of the cast, and he did it even harder in this version of the game because he was a better character and a whole bunch of the other characters were worse. He shouldn't be in B, he should be in S. This is the funniest placement so far. It's just insane that he's this low. Like, I get why it was like that, because he was the newest character at the time. People thought that his bad recovery was more of a problem than it actually was, but he was just insane, and he just nullified so many characters. He's way too low. He should be an S. Easy. And then below him is Ness, who is also too high. Ness is a solid character, but not a great character. He should probably be an E. Yeah, he's way too high as well. Then we have the C tier. Like, the tiers in this tier list are just insane. Like, there's only ladders, and there are just some tiny tiers in places where there don't need to be tiny tiers. It's crazy. It's just wild. Falcon, I can see that. I think he was the same character back then. Pretty solid character. Not an amazing character, but definitely a solid character. He can have his spot up there, but maybe not in a tier above the D tier. But he's definitely better than, like, Villager and Ness. Yoshi is also too high. He should be in the E tier at best. Yoshi was alright in Smash 4, but he wasn't particularly great. He certainly wasn't this high. I don't know what he's doing up there. Then we have the D tier. Luigi? Pretty alright placement. He could maybe be a little bit higher, but overall, not a bad placement. And then we have the pits. Wow. They are also too high. The pits in Smash 4, they were described as the most honest characters in the game. Like, they had a lot of okay stuff, but they didn't have any really good stuff. Although they also didn't have any really bad stuff. But overall, they were just not good characters. They pretty much had nothing, which was really, really good. Everything was just fine. But they also did have weaknesses, like some of their multi-hits were just not good. They had a lot of landing lag on their aerials. They were just not good characters. They were severely lacking. And you know, they're also in that honest section in Ultimate, but they're a lot better in Ultimate with better combo potential, KO power. Here, it's like they do a decent job at winning neutral, but then they don't have very strong advantage states. They're just not good at all in Smash 4. They should be an F tier at best, but you could argue that they're in an even lower tier. They're just not good characters. Peach, I can see that. She should maybe be higher, but that's mainly because there are so many characters who are above her who really should not be. So yeah, no complaints with Peach. Rob at 20th. This is also kind of wild. Rob in Smash 4 was not a good character. He was a tiny bit better back then because his hitboxes were a little bit smaller, but he was still enormous. You could still juggle him for free. Rob in Smash 4 was just bad. He doesn't have the potency he has in Ultimate, like the powerful combos and such. He's just not very good in Smash 4. He has a good grab game, but if you can't get that grab game going, he doesn't have much else. He does have a projectile game, but you can play around his projectiles. And if you can play around his grab and his projectiles, there's not a ton he can do. He's just a lacking character in Smash 4. F tier at best. Wario is also way too high. Again, he's not a terrible character in Smash 4, but he was definitely lacking. He just doesn't have amazing combo potential in Smash 4. His grab game is lacking. His whole ground game in general is lacking. He's just not a great character. He's got the waft, but he doesn't have much else beyond that besides his strong aerial mobility. Probably F tier. Toon Link? This seems like an alright placement for him, although maybe he should be in E. He was a bit worse back then, mainly because his up B was slower, so he had a worse out of shield game. But this isn't an egregious placement for him. There have definitely been more egregious placements than Toon Link at 22nd. Lucario at 23rd. I don't know how to feel about this. Because Lucario was definitely overrated at some points in Smash 4. It's kind of hard to say exactly where he was, because it was a very debatable thing. But I don't know. I think he was the same character back then. Maybe a bit better, maybe a bit worse. I don't remember. He could go higher, mainly because there's so many outrageous placements here. But yeah, I don't know. D tier does seem accurate though. At least if we're using these crazy tiers we got up here. Time for the E tier. Olimar. Yeah, alright. I can see that. Maybe D tier though. Like, he isn't significantly worse than some of the characters in this tier. as in the ones who belong here and not the ones that don't. Yeah, I can see that. Greninja, I think that might be accurate. Greninja was a worse character back then. His grab was quite a bit slower, and his dash attack was slower, so he overall had a worse punish game. So yeah, I could see Greninja being here. Maybe lower, but seems like an alright placement for Greninja. Ike, no. Ike was bad in Smash 4. And this placement is definitely way too high. And he was worse in this version of the game as well. Like, his Nair was a worse combo tool. His Fair was weaker. He was just not a good character in Smash 4. Like, he should be down in the G tier. Maybe even lower. He was just not a good character in Smash 4. And this placement is just way too high. DK, I can see this. Maybe you could put him in D tier, but overall, yeah, I can see this. Mega Man, I guess I can see this as well. No big complaints here. Some of these numbers might be too low, but that's mainly because there are so many characters who are ranked way too high. It's ridiculous. Pac-Man at 29th. No. Pac-Man sucked in Smash 4. And the thing is, he was even worse in this version of the game because his smash attacks were weaker. He was just a very lacking character in Smash 4. Like, he had his projectile game, but that was pretty much all he had. He would be G tier at best, but probably even lower. He's just bad. Bowser, I can see that. He was maybe worse in this version of the game. Some of his tools were worse, but notably his up throw actually had less knockback, so you could do like up throw, up air for a longer period of time, although it didn't start working until a bit later. So he still had the KO confirms, and they even worked for longer. But yeah, he could be a little bit higher, but no major complaints with Bowser. Robin, too high. Robin should at least be a tier lower. Robin in Smash 4 was just not a good character. He was so slow. And I think he was worse in this version of the game as well. Okay, only a tiny bit, but he was just very much a lacking character. He had a KO confirm off his down throw, but that's about it. Solid projectile game, but you could play around that. Now we have the F tier, which sounds a lot worse than it is. But when we start looking into it, that's going to change. Roy is too high. Roy was bad in Smash 4, and he was even worse in this version of the game because all of his areas had more landing lag, so he had to take even bigger risks, and his side B was slower. He is just too high. He should be a tier lower for sure. Maybe even lower than that. Kirby for sure is too high. How is he this high? He was just so bad in Smash 4, and he was even worse in this version of the game because his smash attacks weren't as strong. Which, sure, that's not a big change, but still, he was technically worse in this version of the game. He was really bad. He should be an I tier at best, maybe even the J tier. And another character who is in the same boat, Bowser Jr. Bowser Jr. really sucks in Smash 4, and he was even worse in this version of the game. His smash attacks were laggier, and a few of his aerials were weaker. He was Garbage beyond belief. I tier at best, but maybe even J tier. He was terrible. He was garbage. Game & Watch. I can see. Yeah, that's a fair enough placement, but he should probably be a little bit higher now that I think about it. Yeah, he should probably be a little bit higher. He wasn't a great character in Smash 4, but he wasn't a bad character either. And he's ranked below so many characters who are worse than him. He shouldn't be this low. This F tier in general may be accurate for him, but he could go in the E tier, especially with all these characters who are too high. It's just wild. Lucas! Yeah, I think this tier might be accurate for him. He wasn't a particularly great character in Smash 4, but he did have some stuff. Although there are a whole bunch of characters who are ranked above him who shouldn't be. I feel like I'm going to be saying that a lot. Mewtwo in 37th. No. Mewtwo was worse in this version of the game. He was slower, he was a little bit lighter, and I think there were a couple of other small things. But apart from that, he's not that different how he's in the final game. In fact, in this patch, Mewtwo got majorly buffed, getting a significant increase in his movement speed, frame data, damage/KO power, and all sorts. Mewtwo should not be this low. I mean, if this were the final game, then he'd be in the A tier. But this isn't the final game. This was a version of the game where he was worse. But he would be D tier at the worst, I'd say. Maybe even higher. Mewtwo was worse, but he wasn't that much worse. He should not be down here for sure. This is way too low. Falco? Too high. Falco sucked in Smash 4, and he was even worse in this version of the game. Mainly that his up smash was worse. It was slower, it had worse hitboxes, and it was weaker. There were a couple of other things too, but it was mainly the up smash. Falco was bad. Like, we're talking HI tier bad. He was just slow. He had a decent combo game, but it was also a bit limited as well. He wasn't the worst, but he was definitely lacking. He definitely shouldn't be in the F tier. G tier at the absolute highest, but probably lower. Wii Fit is also too high. G tier at best, but probably even lower. She sucked in Smash 4. Shulk is too low. Like, there are so many characters ranked above him who just shouldn't be. He's F at worst, but maybe even E tier. Like, he was definitely lacking in Smash 4, but he wasn't terrible either. You could definitely do some stuff with him. Marth is also too low. To be fair, he did get some pretty significant buffs in the next patch. I mean, this patch, his jab was slower, so it wasn't as cheesy. All of his aerials were weaker. His range was worse, and his side B was slower. But those things together, I don't think they're 30 places in the tier list worse. Like, D tier, sure, I could see that. E tier, at the absolute worst. But G tier? No! He wasn't that much worse, I think. No way. Link in G tier? Again, I think this is too low. I think he was a little bit worse in this version of the game. A few of his attacks were weaker, but they weren't necessarily key attacks. It was dash attack and down smash from the top of my head. Link in Smash 4, he wasn't a great character, but he wasn't a bad one either. Like, he's F at worst, but maybe E. He's too low. Speaking of characters who are too low, Duck Hunt. They were not that bad. They were a little bit worse back then because their smash attacks were weaker. But apart from that, no, they weren't that bad. E tier. They had solid zoning and all sorts. It was mainly just they had really good zoning and you could use can to get out of combos. They were not bad characters. They weren't great characters, but they weren't bad characters either. Definitely too low. Little Mac, yeah, I can see that. You could maybe rank him lower, but overall displacement, it's not too egregious. Doc, you could rank him lower. But again, I do see this. Little Mac was a little bit worse back then, and I think Doc was the same. So not too egregious. King DDD is maybe too high. Maybe. He was a tiny bit better back then because his air speed was better. But it was only a tiny bit better. So overall, he was still a really bad character, but the competition at the bottom was lower. So maybe he was a bit higher than where he is in the final game. But this might still be a little bit higher. Lucina's placement is even double than Marv's. Like, H tier? No. E tier at the worst. H is just way too low. That's just ridiculous. I tier. Me Brawler, I'm just gonna ignore the me's. Like, I believe the rule sets they were considering were default size 1111, where I think all of them were bad characters, but they were also severely underdeveloped characters. So I really don't have any comments about the Miis. I think they were all the same back then. I just don't have anything to say about them. Charizard. This could be an accurate placement, but he could also be lower. Charizard was worse in this version of the game. All of his aerials had more landing lag, and some of his moves were weaker. But this could be an accurate placement. I'm not fully sure. But overall, not a bad placement for Charizard, I'd say. Because he was definitely worse than he was later on. Palutena is maybe too low. She was a bit worse. Some of her moves were a little bit weaker, but only a few moves. She wasn't that much worse than later versions of the game. 50th is maybe a little bit too low for her. She should be a little bit higher. I could see her being in the G tier. Or maybe H, but yeah, I don't think she's that bad, but she was definitely bad. Then we have J tier. Samus, I think, is too low. Samus was definitely worse in this version of the game. She got a lot of good buffs later on. Things like less lag on dash attack, so it's a better combo tool. A stronger Nair. A more reliable Fair. And things like that. But looking at her change list, I don't think she's that much worse. Like in the final version of Astral, she's a decent character. Not a great character, but a decent one. And I don't think she was that much worse back then. J tier, I think, is too low for her. Like, G tier maybe? F tier if you're feeling generous. But J feels too low for what was changed. There were some significant changes, but not bottom 5 to the middle of the tier list. Me Gunner, me Sword Fighter. I don't have anything to say about them. Ganondorf. Well done. He's bottom 3. And that was accurate. He was worse back then. His jab was slower, his dash attack had more lag, his side B had less range, and his down B was weaker. He was a worse character back then, and he very well could have been the worst character in this version of the game. But putting him up here, I don't think is egregious. Like, bottom 3 definitely seems accurate for Ganondorf in this version of the game. Puff, yeah, I can see that. Same character, very bad. Could be a little bit higher, but not a terrible placement overall. And then Zelda at the bottom, I can see that. She was worse in this version of the game. She got a whole bunch of nice changes later on. Her jab was made stronger, so it became completely safe on shield. Her F tilt was made faster. Her down smash had less lag later on. Her Nair ended up doing more damage later on. And there were a few other things as well, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But she was worse in this version of the game. For sure. She could have been the worst. Oh yes, and her up air was a bit weaker, so her down throw up air wasn't as effective. She could have been the worst character in this version of the game. But definitely not any higher than bottom 3. And then Bayo and Cloud weren't released at this point in time. But they were like 2 days away from being released when this tier list was made. So yeah, that was the first Smash 4 tier list, and that was my take on this tier list. Overall, it's a pretty whack tier list, even considering this was a different version of the game. A lot of characters are way too high or way too low. Obviously, there are a few places where, yeah, it's accurate, but there are plenty of other places where, no, it isn't accurate. This tier list is just absolutely wild. But I think it's interesting to look back on, since it was made well over a year after the game came out, and it does cover an earlier version of the game with different balancing. So yeah, that's the end of this long, scriptless and rambly tier list discussion. Thanks for watching.